Then she said, "All commands, execute wave 1. On my mark." A pause. Mark. The first wave hit the Kreth flank with a simultaneity that should not have been physically possible for a human force without AI battle coordination. It was possible because of a system that had been developed by Chun and a human-computer interface specialist named Dr. Sofia Reyes, a Colombian cognitive scientist who had been doing her postdoctoral research in neural interface technology when the cascade hit, and who had spent 11 years quietly, relentlessly continuing that research. Her system was not AI. It was something different, something that used the human brain's natural capacity for pattern recognition and predictive modeling, channeled through a simplified interface that allowed a commander to process and coordinate complex fleet movements the way a conductor processes an orchestra, not mechanically, not algorithmically, but intuitively. It required months of training. All 53 human fleet commanders had it. None of the Kreth had anything like it. Their coordination was faster in raw processing terms, faster and more precise and capable of handling more variables simultaneously. But it was predictable, and the first wave, 31 fast attack craft and medium-weight vessels, coming in from the flank in angle and velocity that the Kreth formation had not accommodated for, precisely because their tactical AI had assessed the angle as suboptimal and deprioritized it as an incoming threat vector, was not predictable. The Kreth flanking ships began to rotate their weapons arrays. The rotation took 2.4 seconds. In 2.4 seconds, the first wave struck at 11 separate points along the Kreth flank simultaneously, targeting the specific weak points in Kreth hull architecture that 3 years of studying salvage technical data from previous engagements had identified. Not the strongest points, not the most obvious targets. The joints, the places where modular sections connected, the places where a concentrated strike would create cascading structural failure rather than localized damage. 11 strikes. 11 Kreth ships gone in the first pass. Not destroyed, disabled, ruptured, venting, out of formation. The difference matters. 11 disabled ships in 11 specific positions created a gap in the Kreth formation. The second wave was already moving into that gap. Wave 2 came in low. Low in space is a relative term. There is no true below in three-dimensional combat. But the human fleet had established a tactical reference plane, and low meant beneath that plane, in an approach angle that was so geometrically aggressive, diving under the engagement plane, and then rising sharply into the formation's belly, that the Kreth battle AI flagged it as a sensor error. Flagged it. Took 2.4 seconds to reclassify. Took another 1.8 seconds to begin redirecting defensive screens downward, for seconds total. The second wave was inside the formation before the screens turned. They were not deep inside. They went in fast and hard and hit specific secondary targets, command relay nodes, the specific hardware that coordinated fleet-wide defensive responses, and then they came back out. Not clean. 3 human ships took significant hits on the exit. 1 was destroyed. 18 crew. Elena registered the loss on the tactical display. She kept moving. The Kethamara said later, when asked by historians what made the human tactical approach so distinctive, that the most striking thing was not the technical creativity. It was a willingness to absorb damage. Every other species in consensus, when a unit took severe damage, pulled back. It was rational. Damage units are inefficient units. Pulling back is how you preserve fighting capacity. Human military doctrine, as it had evolved over 11 years and 6,000 simulations, treated damage differently, not as a reason to stop, as information. Damage units had already drawn defensive attention. Their positions were being tracked. Their threat vectors were being managed by the enemy systems, which meant they were creating a resource load on those systems, which meant that the systems were spending capacity managing the known threat and had less capacity available to assess the unknown one. The third wave, the one that everyone who later studied the battle would focus on, the one that tactical analysts across 12 civilizations would reconstruct and debate for decades, was the unknown one. The third wave did not attack the Kreth fleet. 15 ships, the heaviest vessels in the human fleet, including the Requiem, moving at maximum sustainable velocity on a vector that no rational tactical model in the consensuses or the Kreth's wargaming history had ever assessed as viable. directly at the Kreth command vessel. The command vessel was at the center of the Kreth formation, protected by overlapping defensive screens from 3 supporting ships, covered by 12 dedicated point defense arrays, surrounded by a buffer of secondary vessels whose function was specifically to intercept incoming threats. Getting to it required passing through all of that. The probability, calculated by every system that attempted it, consensus or Kreth, was below 4%. Elena knew the number. She had run it herself many times. She had never been particularly troubled by it, not because she was careless with the lives of her crew. The opposite. She had thought carefully about the people on those 15 ships, had spoken to many of them personally in the weeks before the engagement, had understood what they were volunteering for. They had all volunteered, every single one. There was a crewman on the 3rd Wave Heavy Vessel Resolution, a young man named Park Junesio, who had been 4 years old when the cascade happened and who therefore had no memory of any world except the one they'd built underground, who had told Elena, when she visited the heavy fleet to speak to crews, that he didn't find the probability scary. 4% is not 0, he said. She had asked him if he understood what 4% meant in practice. He had nodded. It means that if you run the same situation 100 times, it doesn't work 96 of them. Yes, but we're not running it 100 times, he said. We're running it once, and in the one we're running, either it works or it doesn't. She had looked at him for a moment. He was 21 years old. He had been born in the tunnels under the ruins of Seoul, had grown up in the network, had never seen an open sky without a respirator before the atmospheric cleanup efforts of Year 9, had made surface access periodically possible. He understood something about singular events that people raised in a world with more options sometimes didn't. Yes, she said, that's exactly right. The command vessel's first warning came from a point defense array that registered an incoming contact at a range that should not have been possible. The contact had somehow gotten to the buffer ships without triggering their primary detection systems. This was because the Requiem and its accompanying vessels had used the electromagnetic shadow of 3 simultaneously disabled Kreth ships, the debris and venting atmosphere, creating a sensor occluding effect that Chan had predicted and that human pilots had navigated precisely to approach closer than the detection threshold before the command vessel systems had a clean look at them. When the clean look came, the threat assessment took 1.1 seconds. The defensive screens began to realign. The point defense arrays began to spin up. The 4 escort ships deployed to intercept. All of this happened correctly. All of it happened as quickly as it should. The Kreth systems performed exactly as they were designed to perform. It was not enough, because what the Kreth command vessel systems had not modeled, could not have modeled, because it had never been done, was a formation of 15 ships being manually flown at attack velocity by human pilots running on a real-time shared coordination protocol that was not an AI and was not a network, and was something between, something that had no name yet because it had never existed before. The 4 escort intercept ships engaged 3 of the incoming vessels. Those 3 vessels did not break off. They absorbed the fire and kept coming. 2 of them were destroyed before they reached attack range. They had already served their function. They had consumed the escort ship's attention and weapons lock for 3.7 seconds. The remaining 13 vessels in the wave reached firing position. The Requiem was at the center. Elena had no dramatic thought in that moment. She would be asked about this later by historians and psychologists and journalists, all of whom seemed to expect something more cinematic. What had she been thinking in the moment she gave the fire order? She had been thinking about shield geometry. Specifically, the precise angle of approach that would expose the command vessel's second dorsal shield generator to simultaneous fire from the maximum number of her vessels. She had memorized the Kreth command vessel's shield architecture 3 months ago from technical documents in Consensus's data package. She had drilled the attack geometry until it lived in her hands. She gave the fire order. The shield geometry worked. The second dorsal generator failed under concentrated fire from 9 vessels at once. 9 different angles. Time to arrive within a 0.3 second window, a timing requirement that every simulation said was beyond the realistic coordination capacity of a human force without AI integration. They did it in 0.2 seconds. The generator failed. There was a gap in the command vessel shielding. The Requiem was already in it. What happened to the Kreth command vessel after that is documented in technical detail in the battle archives. Elena's own account of those 4 minutes is sparse on tactical specifics. She has said, in various tellings, that she does not remember all of it as a continuous sequence. She remembers flashes. She remembers the heat of her ship's weapons firing continuously. She remembers the structural alerts that started coming in as the Requiem took multiple hits, and her chief engineer, a former automobile mechanic from Buenos Aires named Rodrigo Vega, who had taught himself space vessel engineering through 12 years of applied necessity, started shouting damage assessments that Elena registered but didn't act on because there was nothing to act on. You take the hits. You keep going. She remembers a moment the command vessel's reactors went into emergency shutdown, the tactical display going from a complex web of targeting data to a much simpler picture as the command vessel systems collapsed. She remembers the specific quality of the silence that followed on the tactical channel. Not a complete silence. Ships were still maneuvering. Weapons were still firing elsewhere in the engagement. But on the command channel, for approximately 8 seconds, nobody said anything. Then Tomasi Banya's voice came through from a heavy element, steady and slightly rough in the way of someone who has just been through something. Command vessel is dark. Kreth formation is breaking. Elena looked at her tactical display. He was right. The Kreth formation, without its central command coordination, was fragmenting, not fleeing. The Kreth did not do anything so simple as flee, but reorganizing, pulling back into defensible positions, trying to re-establish command authority through secondary nodes. It would take them time, and the consensus fleet, which had received Elena's warning about the flanking element and had repositioned accordingly, and which had been watching the human fleet's engagement with the Kreth flank with a particular attention of people witnessing something that contradicted their models of what was possible. The consensus fleet was already moving. They hit the disorganized Kreth formation from the front, while the flanking element, which had been caught by the repositioned consensus left wing and engaged before it could complete its arc, was already pinned. The battle lasted 9 hours total. The outcome was not in doubt after the first 40 minutes. The Requiem drifted, not because Elena had ordered it to drift, because the pulse drive had taken 3 direct hits during the final phase of the engagement, and Rodrigo Vega was doing what he could with what he had left, which was somewhat less than what he'd had at the start of the battle. The ship was functional. It was not elegant. Most of the lights in the command space were out. The ones that were still on produced a dim, amber-tinted illumination that made everything look slightly warmer than it was, which Elena found darkly funny, given that the temperature had dropped 4 degrees in the last hour due to the heating system running on partial power. She sat in the commander's seat, the chair that had been salvaged from an old office building in the settlements that had no real business being on a spacecraft, but that someone had bolted in during construction because practicality will always beat aesthetics when you're building under survival conditions. And she looked at the tactical display. The battle was over. The Kreth Advance Fleet, the 3,000 ships that had swept past the Sol system without looking back, the fleet that had been heading toward the consensus core with the confident momentum of something that had never been stopped, was gone. Not entirely gone. Perhaps 400 ships had managed to organize a retreat before consensus force completed the encirclement. They were moving away from the engagement zone at maximum velocity. The consensus fleet was not pursuing. Elena had advised against it in a brief transmission after the command vessel went dark. She didn't know if they would listen. She had no authority over consensus fleet and had never claimed any, but she had sent the advice anyway. Let them go. You need your remaining strength for the next phase. Let the Kreth carry word back of what happened here. Let them carry that back. They had listened. She was, perhaps, a little surprised. The first contact from the Consensus High Command came 4 hours after the battle ended. It was from Admiral Kael'Thyrus, the Velhari officer commanding the Vega Line defense. He was brief and formal, and clearly still in a state of processing, which showed in the slightly unusual precision of his language, the way beings who are shaken tend to become more careful with words. Not less, he said. Commander Vasquez, the Galactic Consensus High Command acknowledges your fleet's engagement in the Vega Corridor action. Your tactical warning regarding the flanking element was accurate and was acted upon. Your fleet's direct engagement with the Kreth advance force was decisive. A pause, longer than the cadence of the speech warranted. I am instructed by Ambassador Sail Orin to inform you that the High Chamber requests formal dialogue at the earliest opportunity. I am also instructed, on my own behalf, to say another pause, that I have been commanding vessels for 3,000 years, and I have never seen anything like what your fleet did here today. Elena listened to the transmission. Then she played it again. Then she said to David, who was standing next to her in the amber-lit command space, "Tell him we'll talk when we collected our people." David transmitted it. "Anything else?" She thought for a moment. "Tell him to bring Sail Orin. Specifically, not a delegate. Him." The response came back in 11 minutes. Sail Orin would attend. Of course he would. The collection of the human fleet. Finding every ship, assessing every crew, accounting for every loss. Took 6 hours. The losses were not small. 7 ships destroyed, for more severely damaged and non-operational, without major repair. Among the destroyed ships, 143 crew. Among the surviving ships, an additional 89 personnel with injuries ranging from significant to critical. The critical cases being treated in the fleet's medical vessels where Dr. Lino Osei, who had set foot on the moon 6 years ago for the first time, was now coordinating triage with a focused, unflappable professionalism that had made her the most essential person on the lunar station for years. 143. Elena looked at the number for a long time. She knew she would carry it for the rest of her life. Not as a weight, exactly, as an account. Something that had to be honored by what came after. She sent a message to the fleet. It was short. To everyone flying. What you did today cannot be taken back. It cannot be undone. Whoever told you that you didn't exist anymore, they know better now. Rest. We have more to do. She didn't add anything else. She didn't need to. The formal dialogue session was held aboard the Requiem. Elena's choice of venue was deliberate. She had been invited to come aboard the Consensus flagship, a vessel so vast and so well-appointed that it made the Requiem look like what it was, which was a very large piece of salvage metal that had been converted into a warship by people working in asteroid cores with limited tools and unlimited determination. The comparison would not have been subtle. The optics would have communicated something she didn't want to communicate. Specifically, that the Consensus's grandeur was relevant to this conversation. It wasn't. Sail Orin came aboard the Requiem through an airlock that had been welded slightly off-center, and which therefore required a slight sideways shift to navigate cleanly. He did this without apparent difficulty or comment. He was accompanied by 2 aides and by Drevsol II of the Kethamara, whose presence had been requested by Elena specifically, through a channel that had surprised Sail Orin and which he had agreed to without fully understanding why she'd asked. He understood when Drevsol II entered the room, and Elena stood to greet them with a formality she hadn't shown Sail Orin. "You were there for a long time," Elena said to Drevsol II, "before the cascade." Drevsol II looked at her with the ancient patience of a being who had spent 800 years watching. "My predecessor was," they said. "I carry their record, and I carry something else they asked to be passed on." They held out a data chip. Elena took it. "We found in the Consensus archive," Drevsol II said, "filed under Observer Subjective Assessment, low priority. We have been waiting for an appropriate moment to return it." Elena held the chip. She knew what it was without reading it yet. She had heard fragments of Drevsol's report through Chen's research into the archive, but having it, holding it physically, was something different. She put it in her pocket. "Thank you," she said. Then she sat down and looked at Sail Orin. The conversation lasted 4 hours. It was not pleasant. It was not designed to be pleasant. Elena had made a decision, in the weeks before the engagement, about how this conversation would go. She was not going to begin from a position of anger. She was not going to make accusations, even true ones, at the opening of negotiation where the outcome mattered more than the expression of grievance. She was not going to perform the righteous fury that many in the network had wanted her to express on their behalf. But she was also not going to pretend. She was not going to allow the meeting to proceed on any terms that did not begin from explicit acknowledgement of what had been done. She said it plainly at the start. "I want to establish what the Consensus did to my species before we discuss anything else. Not to dwell on it. not to use it as leverage, though it is leverage, because we cannot build anything meaningful on a foundation that doesn't include the truth of it. Saleorin was very still. His aides were very still. The compound deployed over Earth's atmosphere 11 years ago was manufactured with Velhari technology, Elena said. It was targeted specifically at human neurology. It was delivered by a black operations vessel operating under consensus authority. It was not a response to any action humanity had taken. It was a decision made on the basis of a probability assessment. She held his gaze. That is what happened. I would like you to confirm it. The room was extremely quiet. Saleorin's aides were very carefully not looking at their superior. Saleorin himself said nothing for a long moment. Then he said, in a voice that was very controlled, "Yes, that is what happened." Elena nodded, just once. Then let's talk about what comes next. What came next was not simple or quick. The negotiations that followed the Vega corridor engagement took 11 months. They involved not just Saleorin and Elena, but representatives from dozens of consensus member species, specialists in a dozen areas of interstellar law and precedent, technical experts from both sides assessing practical matters of integration and resource sharing, and a continuous back channel between Elena and Drevsol 2 that became, over time, something closer to a genuine intellectual exchange than a diplomatic correspondence. The questions were not easy. What status would humanity hold in the consensus? Not a protected species, not a ward, but equal? What did equal mean for a civilization of 300,000 people against a collective that represented 40 billion? What accountability was possible for what had been done? The consensus had no existing framework for prosecuting itself. Building one would require dismantling assumptions that have been embedded in consensus law for 11,000 years. What happened to Earth? The atmospheric damage was partially reversible. The consensus had the technology. But did humanity want consensus involved in the restoration of their own world? Did the act of accepting that assistance compromise the independence Elena had fought to establish? What was humanity's role in the ongoing war? Because the war was not over. The Kreth had retreated from Vega, but the larger campaign was not finished. The consensus needed the human fleet's capability, needed it desperately, and everyone in the room knew it. And humanity needed the consensus's resources to grow beyond the fragile infrastructure of 300,000 underground survivors. They needed each other. Neither side was comfortable with that. Both sides accepted it anyway, because the alternative, failing to build something real out of what had happened at Vega, was worse than the discomfort of honest compromise. The formal agreement, known in consensus records as the Vega Accord and in human records simply as a recognition, was signed 8 months after the battle. It was imperfect. Both sides would say so openly. Lindqvist voted against it, formally and on record, and wrote a detailed analysis of its flaws that was entered into both the consensus archive and the human network's record. Elena made sure that the flaws Lindqvist identified were real and would matter in the years ahead. But it established 3 things that mattered. Humanity existed, recognized, documented, confirmed, not as a species under consensus protection, but as a member civilization, with all the standing and all the obligations that implied. Accountability for the cascade was established in law, not through punishment. There was no punishment framework in consensus law for state-level violence of this kind, and creating one retroactively raised its own legal problems. Through a process of formal commission, a permanent body charged with examining the decisions that had led to the cascade, documenting them in public record, and creating a framework of oversight designed to prevent similar decisions in the future. It was insufficient. Elena said so publicly when she signed. She signed anyway. And the third thing, the thing that Elena had asked for from the very beginning, that had been the axis around which everything else had turned. A seat at the table. Not a seat in the consensus's existing structures, which were designed for their existing members, and which would have required humanity to accept terms written before they existed. A seat in a new body. The Council of Recent Civilizations, a deliberately unglamorous name, chosen by Elena over Saleorin's several more elaborate suggestions, was a formal chamber within the consensus structure specifically for species that had emerged or re-established themselves within the last 5,000 years. There were 7 such species. Humanity would be the 8th. The council's decisions required ratification by the full consensus, but could not be overridden without cause, a provision that had been one of the most contentious points of the entire negotiation. It was not perfect representation. It was a start. Sail Orin came to see Elena the morning after the recognition was signed. He came alone. He had never, in Elena's experience, done anything alone. Velhari protocol required witnesses for almost all official interactions. Coming alone was itself a statement. He said, "I have something that I should have said at the beginning of our conversation, 8 months ago, before anything else. Before you had to ask for confirmation." He paused. "I was afraid of what it would mean to say it first, of what would imply about the consensus, about my own involvement in the decisions that led to this." Elena waited. "I approve the cascade," Sail Orin said. "Not alone. The decision was made by a council of 11, but I voted yes. I accepted the model. I accepted the 94.7% and the 67.3%, and the calculation that those numbers justified what we did." His voice was careful and very flat. "I was wrong, not procedurally wrong. The procedure was followed correctly. Fundamentally wrong. Wrong about what the model could actually tell us. Wrong about what the numbers actually meant. Wrong about whether civilization stability is the right measure of its value." He stopped. He looked at Elena, not the way he usually looked at her, which was a look of an experienced diplomat managing a complicated situation. He looked at her the way that people sometimes look at each other when they are not being diplomats or commanders or representatives of anything except themselves. "I cannot undo it," he said. "I know that. I am not asking you to forgive it. I don't believe that's mine to ask of you." He paused. "I am asking whether, given what you've seen of the consensus and of me personally over these 8 months, you believe it is possible to build something worth building with us, despite this." Elena was quiet for a moment. She thought about Mr. Pakrashi, about circulation, about the thing that keeps everything moving. "That's the only thing worth building," she said. "Despite everything, that's always been the only kind of building that matters." Sail Orin was quiet. Then he said very quietly, "I am beginning to understand why your species was so difficult to model. Because the models always assumed we'd stop." Elena said, "Yes. We don't stop," she said. "Not when it matters. It's not something we decided. It's something we are. I don't know if that makes us dangerous or important or both." She looked at him. "I suspect it makes us both." He nodded. He left. Elena stood alone in the meeting room of the Requiem for a while. In the amber light, surrounded by the welded and bolted reality of what 300,000 people had built in the dark. Part 9, The Stars Know. 2 years after the Vega Accord, the surface of the Earth was accessible again. Not everywhere. Not yet. And not for prolonged exposure without filtration in the hardest hit regions, but in significant parts of the planet. The southern hemisphere, the highlands, the northern latitudes. The atmospheric restoration project was producing measurable results. The consensus had contributed technology. Human chemistry teams had contributed adaptations. Dr. Ben David, who was 65 and who had announced 2 years earlier that she intended to be the first person to stand outside without a respirator when it became possible, was tracking the compound's decay rate with the same meticulous obsession she brought to its initial analysis. She had told Elena in a recent transmission that she estimated 18 months. Elena had put it in her calendar. The reconstruction projects on the surface were extraordinary in their ambiguity, not the physical reconstruction. That part was simply engineering, enormously complex but understandable as a process. The ambiguity was human and historical. What do you rebuild? What do you leave? There were cities on Earth that had been ruined for 11 years, that nature had begun to reclaim in the way it always does when humans are absent. Vines and scrub and the patient reoccupation of spaces that had once been pavements and plazas. There were places where the ruins had a strange beauty, and arguments had emerged in the network about whether to clear them or preserve them, whether the ruins were wounds to be healed or documents to be kept. Elena didn't have strong opinions about this, and she said so publicly, which surprised some people. She had thought about it, though. She thought that you could do both. You could rebuild, and you could document. You could move forward, and you could remember. They weren't opposites. They were the same thing, seen from different angles. The human fleet was being integrated into a broader, consensus-aligned force structure for the ongoing conflict with the Kreth. This was complicated, not militarily. The integration of human tactical doctrine into a broader fleet framework raised significant challenges, mostly because human doctrine was, by consensus standards, highly unusual, and replicating its effectiveness required either training the other species in human approaches, which took time and produced uneven results, or finding the specific tactical niches where human and consensus capabilities were complementary. The complication was social. Human fleet commanders, arriving in consensus fleet structures that had existed for centuries, found themselves in an interesting position. They were too skilled to be junior partners. They were too few and too newly present to be senior ones. They occupied a specific in-between territory that required constant negotiation, both of tactical responsibility and of the older, deeper question of how humanity fit into a galaxy that had spent 11,000 years building its hierarchies without them. Tomas Ibanez, who commanded the human fleet element in a joint exercise 6 months after the Accord, reported back to Elena that the main thing he'd learned from 3 days of working alongside Velhari and Furin and Mersoli's commanders was that they have very good equipment and very rigid assumptions, and mixing them is an interesting problem. Elena asked him if he'd managed it. He said, "Well enough, they'll be better for it. So will we." She had laughed, genuinely, which she was doing more often these days, not because the situation was lighter, because she decided, somewhere in the 14 months between the battle and the Accord, that laughter was not a luxury. It was load-bearing. Commander Park Junesio was promoted to captain of his own vessel 6 months after the battle. The ceremony was held on the lunar station, which had, in the 2 years since the recognition, grown from its original 4 rooms to a complex of over 200 spaces housing a permanent population of more than 3,000. It still looked nothing like what most consensus members considered a proper installation. It had the specific aesthetic of things built by people who cared more about function than form, which is to say it had character rather than grandeur. Park's promotion ceremony was attended by about 100 people in person and by several thousand via the web. Elena attended in person. She pinned the rank insignia herself. Park was 22 years old. He had been born in the ruins of Seoul. He had never seen Earth's surface without a respirator until 6 months ago, when the first safe zone windows had opened and a small group from the settlements had gone up to stand outside for the first time. He had told Elena, afterward, that it was very bright. She had said yes. He had said the sky was bigger than he'd expected from the photographs. She had said it always is. He had stood there for a long time, looking at it. There are things about the human presence and consensus that resisted easy categorization from beginning. Drevsol too wrote about this in a scholarly paper that became one of the most discussed documents in consensus academic circles for the following decade. The paper was titled, simply, On the Peculiarity of Velocity. Its central argument was not that humans were special in any cosmic or transcendent sense, a claim that Drevsol too was careful to avoid, because it was both unverifiable and historically problematic. The argument was more specific than that. The consensus had spent 11,000 years developing a deep understanding of civilizational patterns. They knew how long things took. They knew the rhythms of development, of crisis, of recovery, of growth. They had calibrated their institutions and their expectations and their models on these rhythms. Humanity operated at a different rhythm. Not better, not worse. Different in a specific sense of being genuinely off-scale, not faster or slower than expected, but both simultaneously in different domains. Culturally, humanity moved quickly. Technologically, given what resources and context humanity had available, humanity moved at a pace that most consensus models had no framework for. Emotionally, and here Drevsol too made a point that caused considerable debate in academic circles. Emotionally, humanity was both more volatile and more durable than any equivalent species in consensus's recorded history. More volatile. They felt things more intensely, recovered less smoothly, carried the weight of experience in ways that produced both brilliance and fragility. More durable. They kept moving anyway. The paper's conclusion argued that this combination, the intensity and the durability together, was a thing that the 94.7% model had fundamentally failed to capture. because the model could measure intensity and identify it as a destabilizing factor. What it could not measure was what humans did with the instability. They drove through it. They took the chaos and the grief and the anger and the impossible weight of surviving things that should not have been survivable, and they drove through it to the next thing and the next thing and the next, not without cost. The cost was enormous. It always had been, but they didn't stop. This, Drevsall wrote in the paper's final line, is perhaps the only thing that matters about them. And it was perhaps the only thing that no one thought to put in the model. The first child born on the surface of Earth in 12 years arrived on a Tuesday morning in the restored green zone outside what had once been Bogota. Her parents were both second-generation network survivors, people who had grown up entirely in the tunnels and the settlements who had no memory of the surface from before. Her mother was an agricultural technician. Her father was a structural engineer, trained by a Morris Elisa's program. She was born without complications. She was named Lucia. Elena received the news 4 hours later via the web, a transmission that contained photograph. A woman holding a newborn in the green light of a room that had actual windows, actual sunlight coming through, actual sky visible beyond the glass. Elena looked at the photograph for a very long time. She sent back one word: congratulations. She was going to write more. She had a lot more to say. But she looked at the photograph again and thought that some things are their own complete statement, and anything she added would be something she was putting on the moment for herself, not for people in it. Lucia, her mother's name, who had kept water, who had known which walls were load-bearing. 6 months later, Elena made a request through official channels that she had been considering for almost 2 years. She requested access to Consensus Archive Entry 774, the complete entry, not the summary she'd been given as part of the Accord negotiations, the full record. Everything the Consensus had observed, documented, assessed, and filed about humanity over 12,000 years of watching. Every report from every observer, every probability model, every decision memo, including the ones that had led to the cascade. The request required formal Consensus High Chamber approval. Sail-Orin supported it. Drevsall too supported it with a formal statement that described the full access as not merely appropriate, but historically necessary. The Chamber approved it by a wide margin. The archive data transfer took 3 days, because the entry was, as it had always been, enormous. Elena and Chin spent 2 months going through it. What they found was not what she had expected. Exactly. She had expected anger to be the primary response. And there was anger. Reading the clean, precise language of the probability assessments, the management decisions, the careful bureaucratic distance maintained between the decision makers and the people the decisions affected. Yes, there was anger, but the larger response was something else. It was a kind of recognition, because in the archive, buried in decades of observational data, in the field reports and the survey analyses and the cultural assessments, were all these moments, human moments. A Velhari observer recording, with something that read almost like reluctant wonder, a description of the first moon landing, a Kethamara report on the specific social dynamics of human cities, the way they built toward each other, the density and the noise and the specific kind of life that comes from many different people occupying the same space without consuming each other. A Furin survey noting, with characteristic Furin practicality, that human economic behavior was anomalous in its tolerance for long-term sacrifice in pursuit of outcomes that the actors involved may not personally benefit from. Sacrifice for outcomes they would not personally benefit from. They had been watching all along. They had seen something. They hadn't known what to do with it. They had filed it under various categories and deprioritized it and moved on, but they had seen it. Elena sat with this for a long time. Then she wrote something. Not a speech. She was not by nature a speaker of formal speeches, and had given very few even during the years when she was making decisions that required people to follow her. Not a policy document or a diplomatic note, a letter addressed to the Council of Recent Civilizations, and through them to Consensus at large, and through them to the galaxy. It said, "We have read the archive, every word of it. We understand now, more completely than we did before, how we were seen, how we were assessed, what was decided and why and by whom. We are not writing to relitigate any of that. We have our forums for accountability, and we will use them. We are writing because the archive contains something else. It contains 12,000 years of someone watching us. And in 12,000 years of watching, even those who ultimately decided we were not worth keeping saw this. We build things. We break them and we build them again. We hurt each other and we help each other, and we grieve and we go on. We go on. Whatever model you build, whatever probability you assign, whatever category you place us in, please understand that we will not fit neatly into it. We did not fit neatly into any model you had when we were barely starting. We fit even less neatly now, not because we are exceptional in any cosmic sense, simply because we refuse, with everything we are, to be only what the model expects. We will always be something else, something more, something the model didn't account for. We cannot help it. It is what we are. We are asking you, not as a request for sympathy, not as a diplomatic communication, but as a plain statement of fact, to update the model and then update again, because we will keep changing. We will keep moving. We will keep going toward the next thing and the next, not because we are fearless. We are full of fear, not because we have no limits. We have broken against our limits many times, but because we are not finished. We are never finished. Whatever you thought you knew about us, please know this. We have barely started. We are just beginning. And the galaxy, your galaxy, our galaxy, this one thing we all share, has not yet seen what we become. It was signed, United Human Remnant. The letter was entered into Consensus Archive. It was filed under a new category, Species 774. Status, active. On a Tuesday morning, 18 months after recognition was signed, Dr. Yael Ben-David walked outside. She walked outside without a respirator. She was 66 years old. She had been planning this moment for 12 years. She had calibrated it to the day. Her own atmospheric models, checked weekly, had predicted this window with an accuracy she was quietly, fiercely proud of. She had told almost no one. She didn't want an audience. She had spent 12 years being useful, being necessary, being the person who explained things and solved things and figure out what the compound was and how it decayed and what the restoration process needed to proceed correctly. She had done all of that gladly because it needed doing and because she was the person who could do it. This moment, she wanted for herself. It was early morning. The air in this part of what had once been Israel was clear and cold, and the sky was the color that the sky is just before dawn, when you cannot quite see what is coming, but you know it is coming. She stood on a hillside. She breathed in. The air smelled like stone and dew and something else. Something alive, something growing, that she had not been able to smell through a respirator for 12 years. She stood there for a long time. She did not think about the compound or the model or the 94.7% or the decision that had been made in a chamber far away by beings who had looked at her planet and seen a problem to be solved. She thought about her parents, who had not survived the first week. She thought about them often, not with the specific quality of grief that she carried in the early years, that had changed into something else, something that had less weight and more permanence, more like carrying something carefully than struggling under it. She breathed. She watched the sky lighten. And when the sun came over the horizon and the light hit the hillside and the world was visible again, really visible without glass or filter between her and it, she sat down on the ground, right where she was, and she looked at it. Just looked. The way you look at something you thought you'd lost. The way you look at something you're seeing for the first time. Both at once. She stayed there until morning was fully established and the day had begun and people were moving in the settlement below, their voices carrying on the clean air, and she thought, we were declared extinct. We are not extinct. We built ships in the dark. We flew them across the cold between stars. We hit a battle that everyone who ran the numbers said we couldn't win, and we won it in 9 hours, and the galaxy had to rewrite its archive. And now here we are, on a hillside, in the morning, breathing. She thought, what a thing to be, what a complicated, terrible, extraordinary thing to be. She walked back down the hillside, and she went to work, because there was more to do. There was always more to do, and that was fine. That was, if you stood far enough back to see a whole, the whole point. In the Consensus Archive, entry 774 grew. Every month, new material was added. Reports from the joint military exercises, diplomatic correspondences from the Council of Recent Civilizations, cultural exchange documents, humans sharing things from 11 years of building, the consensus sharing things from 11,000 years of existing, scientific collaborations, arguments about policy and jurisdiction, and the specific complicated questions that arise when a civilization with 300,000 people has to operate as an equal within a structure designed for civilizations with populations in the billions. The archive grew, and in its depths, still the original entry, Species 774, the first survey notation, the 12,000 years of observational data, the probability models, the management decision, the 11 years of silence, the transmission, we're not extinct, we've been watching, the battle record, the accord, the letter, we are just beginning. Archivist Desley Vorn, daughter of the being who had filed the extinction record, who had taken over her mother's position 4 years ago and who had spent those 4 years doing her own specific reckoning with the archive she inherited, came to the entry regularly. She read different parts of it each time. Sometimes the early survey data, with its careful detachment and its occasional cracks of reluctant observation. Sometimes the battle record, which was technically precise and emotionally overwhelming in a way that she had not expected when she first read it. Sometimes a letter. We will keep going toward the next thing and the next. She had been an archivist for 40 years. She had never read any document in the archive more than twice. Most of them she read once. She had read the human letter 11 times. She didn't fully understand why. She thought it might be because the letter was doing something that very few documents in the archive did. It was not reporting. It was not explaining. It was not arguing. It was promising. And in 40 years of archiving, she had not encountered many species that made promises to the galaxy and then showed up 11 years later and kept them. She thought about that sometimes when the archive was quiet. She thought, maybe this is what we missed. Not the chaos, not the instability, not the velocity, the promises, the specific human, completely irrational willingness to promise something impossible and then spend every available resource trying to deliver it. Maybe that's what we should have been measuring. Maybe that's what a model needs to account for, if it's ever going to be right about them. Not what they are, what they're reaching for. On a Tuesday afternoon, in the command space of the Requiem, which had been repaired, which was flying again, which would always be flying again because Rodrigo Vega had once announced publicly that this ship was going to outlive the sun and had then gone back to fixing it. Elena Vasquez looked at the stars. She had been looking at them for 32 years. They had not become ordinary. She had wondered once if they would, if familiarity would take the edge off them, if the years of fly among them would make them more like backdrop and less like whatever they had been when she was 19, standing at a bus stop in the early morning, earphones and catching a glimpse of something she couldn't name. They hadn't. If anything, they had become more, because now she knew something about them. Not their names and distances, though she knew those. Not their spectral types or their planetary systems, though she knew those too. Something different. She knew that they had been there when her mother kept water in a basement. They had been there when Mr. Pakrashi recorded his thoughts about circulation. They had been there when Bao Shin cut the first room out of lunar rock with hand tools, and when Priya Kapoor figured out the nutrient ratios, and when Chun Wei sat with a photograph on his wall, and track signals from a war humanity had no business surviving. They had been there for all of it, and now humanity was among them, not as a grace granted by someone else, not as a category in someone else's archive, as a fact, as a presence, as a civilization that had been written off and had answered back. The galaxy had made one very old, very costly mistake. It looked at everything complicated and painful and hard to model about human beings. All the grief, all the stubbornness, all the specific, irreducible refusal to accept that a bad outcome was permanent, and called a flaw. It wasn't a flaw. It was the whole point. It had always been the whole point. Elena Vasquez looked at the stars, and she thought, we're just getting started.